I'm Rachel Monroe, 34 years old, and I thought I knew what family loyalty meant. After our annual reunion dinner, I walked into my apartment still carrying the smell of rain on my coat and laughter that wasn't mine ringing in my ears. When I opened my banking app, the number staring back at me didn't make sense, $486. Just yesterday, there had been over 15,000. My breath caught as my mind tried to explain it away, a glitch maybe or some delayed transfer, but deep down, I knew. And when my father's smug voice replayed in my head saying, "We needed it more than you," everything inside me went still. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you've ever had to find strength in the silence after someone you loved took advantage of your kindness. I grew up in the small town of Maple Ridge, where my parents' house sat at the end of a gravel road lined with oak trees that turned gold every October. My father Douglas built that house with his own hands, and he made sure we never forgot it. He used to say, "A family should take care of its own," and back then I believed that was something beautiful. My mother Evelyn filled our kitchen with the smell of fresh bread and quiet apologies. She'd smooth over every argument with a soft voice, telling me that peace was more important than being right. And my younger brother Caleb, he was the kind of boy everyone wanted to save. Charming, reckless, always promising to do better next time. By the time I was 12, I'd learned that in our family responsibility had a weight to it. When Dad's business hit a rough patch, it was Mom who clipped coupons and sold her jewelry. When Caleb crashed his bike and broke his arm, it was me who stayed up through the night keeping him company so Mom could rest. I used to think that being dependable was my superpower. What I didn't realize was that it would also be the leash they'd hold for years. After college, I took a job in the city, living on instant coffee and secondhand furniture. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. My parents bragged about me to their friends, calling me their success story. I didn't know then that to them my success wasn't mine. It was the family's safety net waiting to be used. When Dad's truck broke down, I wired him money before he even asked. When Mom forgot to pay the electric bill, I covered it without hesitation. Caleb's rent, a temporary loan, became a regular debit I no longer questioned. It was never about gratitude. It was about expectation. I told myself it was fine. That's what good daughters did. I worked long hours, skipped trips, and learned to stretch every dollar. On holidays, they'd look at me like a lifeline dad, with that proud grin, Mom with her practiced sigh, Caleb with his easy smile. And each time I told myself they loved me for it. But lately something in me had started to ache in quiet rebellion. I'd watch other people my age building lives, buying homes, taking vacations, while I was still sending money home and telling myself it was just until they got back on their feet. That night, sitting in my car outside their house after the reunion, I remembered how Caleb had joked at dinner that I'd always come through. The words had earned a round of laughter, but there'd been no humor in my chest. When I'd asked Dad about the missing money, his answer, so calm, so casual, wasn't even denial. "You'll be fine. You've always been fine." It wasn't the first time I'd heard that line, but something about the way he said it, like it was a family motto, told me it would be the last time I'd ever accept it. The rain had stopped by the time I left their house, but puddles still reflected the streetlights like shards of glass. My phone buzzed in my hand with another low balance alert, and I just stared at it until the light dimmed. My father's words echoed again, soft but cruel. "We needed it more than you." Maybe they thought that would end the conversation, that I'd swallow the loss the way I always did. But as I sat there in the quiet, I knew something had shifted. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just hurt. I was done. And as the night deepened and the wind pressed against my car windows, I opened my laptop, still trembling, and stared at my bank records. Every charge, every withdrawal, every lie disguised as family help. My fingers hovered above the keyboard, my breath steadying into something cold and deliberate. I didn't know yet what I'd do, but I knew one thing for certain: whatever happened next, they wouldn't see it coming. The drive home after that night felt endless. Streetlights slid across the windshield like quiet witnesses as my mind replayed every word from the living room confrontation. Dad's face relaxed, and certain Mom's knitting clicking in rhythm, Caleb's voice cutting through it all with that familiar arrogance, "You always help. That's what you're for." By the time I reached my apartment, my stomach was tight enough to hurt. I left my coat draped over a chair and sank onto the couch, the glow from my phone screen still open to the drained account. $15,000 gone, reduced to a balance that wouldn't even cover next month's rent. I barely slept. Each time I closed my eyes, memories surfaced in a slow parade moments I'd long buried because they were easier to excuse than confront. The summer after college, Dad's truck had broken down on the highway, and he'd called me before the tow truck even arrived. "You'll handle it right, honey?" he'd said, the same way he might ask someone to pass the salt. I'd just started my first job, earning barely enough to pay my bills, but I'd written him a check anyway. He'd promised to pay me back once things stabilized. They never did. Then came the year Caleb moved back home after losing another job. Mom told me it was temporary, just until he could find something steady. 2 months later, she asked if I could spot his phone bill, then his rent, then a car payment so he could drive to interviews that never happened. Every time I hesitated, she reminded me that he was trying, that family looked out for one another. I'd tell myself it wasn't a big deal. I was single, no kids, no mortgage. What harm was there in helping? What I didn't see was how the small favors were stacking up into a lifetime of obligations. The pattern grew quietly. Dad's property taxes one year, a new washing machine the next, groceries when the pantry ran low. I kept waiting for gratitude, for even a small attempt at repayment, but it never came. What I got instead was expectation. At birthdays, Dad would toast me for being the responsible one. Mom would sigh with pride, saying I had such a generous heart. Caleb would grin and raise his glass, knowing exactly what the words meant. Confirmation that I'd keep paying the invisible debt they'd written for me. When I lost my job for 6 months, not one of them offered to help. I didn't even tell them how bad it was. I survived on ramen noodles and dollar store coffee until I found another position. And the day I got my first paycheck, I sent Mom money for their water bill because she said the notice had come with a red stripe across the top. Looking back, I realized that was when I stopped being their daughter and became their solution. Now, sitting in the half-dark of my apartment, I opened my laptop and scrolled through years of statements. My fingers hovered above each line. Electronic transfers labeled family cash, withdrawals in towns I hadn't visited, recurring payments that lined up perfectly with their crises. I had always known where the money went, but I'd refused to see what it meant. They hadn't asked anymore because they didn't have to. They believed it was mine to give and theirs to spend. By morning, the city outside was washed clean from the rain. I brewed coffee strong enough to sting and stared out at the wet sidewalks, the world carrying on like nothing had happened. My phone buzzed with a message from Mom Hope. "You got home safe. Love you." No mention of the missing money, no hint of remorse. Just routine affection, a quick patch over a wound that was still bleeding. I wrote back a single word, "fine," and turned my phone face down. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I'd always loved that sound when I came home after a long day. It meant stability, control, normal life. But now even that small hum felt hollow. I couldn't stop hearing Dad's tone, so confident, so certain he was right. "You'll be fine. You've always been fine." Late that afternoon, I drove to their house again, not to see them, but to remind myself what I was walking away from. The place looked the same as always, the porch light flickering Mom's flower pots, arranged in a perfect line, Dad's old toolbox rusting near the steps. I sat in the car for nearly 10 minutes before I could make myself get out. Through the window, I saw them at the table, Mom knitting, Dad watching the news, Caleb hunched over his phone. It could have been any night in the last 15 years, only this time I wasn't part of that picture anymore. I didn't knock. I didn't call. I turned the engine back on and drove past the grocery store where Mom used to send me for milk, past the diner, where Dad would meet his friends and brag about how well I was doing. The farther I went, the lighter I felt, though the anger still burned beneath it like an ember that wouldn't die. When I finally pulled into my apartment lot, I knew what had to come next. I couldn't undo the years I'd spent feeding their needs, but I could stop pretending it was love. I grabbed a notebook and started writing everything I could remember. Dates, payments, promises, every just until next month. It wasn't about revenge. It was about proof, something solid to hold on to when their words started twisting the truth again. Hours passed without me noticing. My hand cramped from writing, but I kept going until the page was filled with numbers and small notes about each transaction. The total at the bottom made me swallow hard, nearly $50,000 over the years, not counting the 15 they'd just taken. I sat back and stared at that number until the ink began to blur. The sound of thunder rolled outside, soft and distant, and I realized the rain was returning. I stood at the window watching it hit the glass, each drop sharp against the city lights. Somewhere out there, my parents were probably finishing dinner. Caleb laughing over something on his phone, and not one of them thinking about what they'd done. I closed the notebook and set it beside my laptop. Tomorrow, I'd start organizing the digital records, the screenshots, the evidence of every time they'd crossed the line. I didn't know what I'd do with it yet, but I knew I couldn't go back. That night, sleep finally came heavy and dreamless. When I woke before dawn, the sky was still dark. I poured another cup of coffee and sat at the table staring at the faint reflection of my face in the window. For years, I'd told myself that family came first, that loyalty meant sacrifice. Now I wasn't sure if I even knew what loyalty was anymore. A message arrived around 7. "Dad, call when you can. We need to talk." I deleted it without opening. Then I gathered the printed statements from the night before, slid them into a folder, and placed it in my bag. The paper edges brushed against my palm, crisp and real. I didn't feel brave yet, just steady. Whatever came next would come because I was finally willing to see the truth. And somewhere deep down, I knew that by the time this was over, none of us would ever be the same again. The week that followed passed in a strange kind of quiet. Each morning I woke before dawn, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table surrounded by piles of printed statements and handwritten notes. I traced every transaction back to a date, every date back to a phone call, a visit, or one of my father's requests disguised as family emergencies. The more I connected the dots, the clearer it became that this wasn't a single moment of betrayal, it was years of conditioning disguised as care. My apartment, once a place of rest, had turned into a small investigation room, the air filled with the sound of papers shifting and the low hum of the refrigerator in the corner. I kept my phone face down on the counter, missed calls stacked up from Mom and Dad, each one unanswered. There were short voicemails, too, Mom's voice layered with worry, Dad's heavy with annoyance, but I couldn't bring myself to listen. I needed distance to think, and for the first time, silence felt like protection. On the third day, I opened my old laptop, the one I'd used in college, and started compiling everything. Each file I labeled with precision utility bills, loans, covered unauthorized transfers. It wasn't about punishment yet. It was about clarity, about finally seeing the truth without the haze of guilt clouding it. That evening, I left the apartment to clear my head. The air outside was crisp, smelling faintly of rain and pavement. I walked without direction, letting the city noise fade behind me until I found myself parked at the small overlook where I used to come after long work days. From there, you could see the entire skyline, bright and endless, a reminder that life was bigger than any single heartbreak. I sat on the hood of my car for a while, watching headlights snake along the freeway, and promised myself I wouldn't let their choices define me anymore. The next morning, I received a message from Mom. "Dinner tonight. Just us. Let's talk." There was a period after every word like she'd typed it, slowly measuring her tone. I almost deleted it, but curiosity held me back. Just us had never meant peace in our family. It meant control, the chance to pull someone back in before they drifted too far. I stared at the message for several minutes, then set the phone down and returned to my work. By noon, I had built a complete timeline of every withdrawal, every purchase, and every transfer tied to their names. When the sun dipped low, I drove across town again, this time not toward their house, but to the old diner near the highway. It was the place where Dad had once taught me how to balance a checkbook over coffee and pie, back when I still thought those lessons were about independence. I sat in a booth, ordered tea, and opened my laptop. The receipts lined up in neat rows, $15,000 gone in a matter of days, spread across bills, grocery stores, and strangely, an electronic shop and a high-end salon. Those last two made my stomach twist. I hadn't wanted proof of self-indulgence, but there it was. When I got home, I backed up everything to a secure drive and sent a copy to a cloud folder. Then I called someone I hadn't spoken to in years. An old college friend named Morgan, who now worked in the local police department. Her voice was warm and familiar when she answered. Rachel. It's been forever. I hesitated before explaining why I called careful with my words, not wanting to sound frantic. She listened quietly, then said, I can't take your case, but I'll connect you with someone who can. Harper Lawson, Financial Crimes. Tell her I sent you. I thanked her, and she added softly, I'm glad you're doing this. You deserve better than what they've been putting you through. After the call, I sat at my kitchen table again, the folder of evidence resting beside my untouched dinner. I wasn't sure what doing this really meant yet. I only knew that I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Later that night, I drafted an email to Detective Lawson explaining the situation briefly and attaching a few files for review. My hands trembled when I hit send, but when the message disappeared from the screen, a strange calm settled over me. Days went by without a reply, but I didn't feel anxious. Instead, I filled the time by working late, cleaning the apartment, and ignoring the string of messages from my family. Their tone shifted with each day. First guilt, then irritation, then silence. I could almost hear my father pacing their kitchen trying to decide how to pull me back in. On Friday morning, an email appeared in my inbox. Detective Lawson, appointment confirmation. The words looked simple, almost mundane, but to me they felt like the start of something irreversible. That afternoon, I sat across from Detective Lawson in a quiet office that smelled faintly of paper and coffee. She was around my age, maybe a few years older, with kind eyes that didn't look away when I stumbled through my story. I showed her the folders, the spreadsheets, the screenshots. She took notes, asking precise questions, never interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back and said, You've done a lot of the legwork already. What happened here isn't just unethical, it's criminal. The word hung in the air, heavy and final. She explained what the next steps would look like, how evidence would be verified, and what my options were if I wanted to pursue charges. I nodded, unsure whether to feel relief or grief. They're my family, I said quietly. They still are, she replied, but that doesn't make what they did right. Before I left, she gave me her card and told me to call when I was ready to move forward. Driving home, I felt the shift happening inside me, a slow, steady turning that didn't come with anger. This time, only resolve. I parked in my usual spot, turned off the engine, and sat there watching the streetlights flicker across the windshield. My hands no longer shook the way they had that first night. For years I'd been the one they leaned on. Now, for the first time, I was standing on my own. That night I slept soundly. No dreams, no restless tossing, just the kind of deep, heavy sleep that comes after a decision has been made. The next morning when my phone rang again, I didn't flinch. I answered, and it was Mom's voice, too bright, too rehearsed. Sweetheart, can we talk tonight? Just us at home. Her tone was calm, but underneath it, I could hear the fear of losing control. I agreed to come knowing exactly why she wanted me there. This time, though, I wasn't going to be caught off guard. As I hung up, I glanced at the folder on the table, neatly sealed and ready. The evidence was complete, and so was my resolve. Whatever waited for me in that house, I would face it head on. When I pulled into my parents' driveway that evening, the house looked too bright. Every light in the front windows glowed as if they were expecting guests, but the yard was quiet. I parked beside Dad's old truck, still dented from the accident he never paid to fix, and sat for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel. My pulse was steady, but my chest felt tight. I'd promised myself this would be the last time I let them speak to me like nothing had happened. Through the window, I could see Mom arranging silverware at the dining table, her movements slow and deliberate. Dad sat at the head of the table, shoulders squared the same way he always positioned himself when he was about to settle a family dispute. Caleb leaned against the wall, phone in hand, pretending not to care. The scene felt staged, as if everyone had rehearsed their roles. I stepped inside and closed the door softly behind me. The familiar smell of my mother's candles and furniture polish filled the air. Caleb glanced up first, smirking just enough to make my stomach twist. "Look who decided to show up," he said, like he was teasing me about being late to dinner. I set my bag down and replied evenly, "Let's just get this over with." Mom gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit, please. We just want to talk." I stayed standing. Dad cleared his throat, his voice carrying that mix of authority and disappointment that used to silence me when I was younger. "Rachel, you're upset, and I understand that. But you have to realize we were struggling. We didn't have any other choice," Caleb added without looking up. "You've always been the one we can count on. It's not like this is new." His words landed heavy, and for a moment I could almost hear the echo of every time I'd bailed them out before. I folded my arms and said quietly, "You didn't ask. You took. That's not family. That's theft." Mom's eyes darted toward Dad, then back to me. "Don't use that word. We're not criminals. We used it for things that mattered: bills, food, the mortgage." Her tone was pleading, but it carried no apology. I tilted my head slightly. 1,000 at an electronics store, 600 at a salon. That's what mattered. Caleb finally put his phone down. "You went through our stuff. That's private." I looked straight at him. "It's my account, Caleb. You went through mine first." Silence settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Dad leaned forward, elbows on the table, trying to reassert control. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be. We'll pay you back." I raised an eyebrow. "With what money?" No one answered. Mom's fingers twisted the edge of a napkin until it tore. "We thought you'd understand," she whispered. "You've always been there for us." I took a slow breath. "That was my mistake. I thought caring about you meant letting you take whatever you wanted. I was wrong." Caleb scoffed and shook his head. "So what, you're going to call the cops? Put your own family in jail. Don't be ridiculous." His voice carried that same mocking confidence that used to shut me down. This time, it didn't. I almost smiled. "You'll find out soon enough." The words hung in the air. Dad's jaw tightened as he studied me, trying to decide if I was bluffing. Mom's eyes glistened, though whether from guilt or fear I couldn't tell. I picked up my bag, feeling the weight of the folder inside. "If you have anything else to say, now's the time," I said softly, "because the next time we talk, it won't just be us in the room." I turned toward the door. Behind me, Caleb muttered something under his breath, but no one else spoke. I could feel all their eyes on my back, not with regret, but disbelief. They still didn't think I'd do it. That thought followed me as I stepped outside into the cool night air. The porch light flickered, casting uneven shadows across the yard. For the first time, their house didn't look like home. It looked like a place where I'd left too much of myself behind. Driving away, I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I just focused on the road ahead, the hum of the tires steady beneath me. Every mile between us felt like a boundary forming in real time, one I'd needed for years, but never dared to draw. When I reached my apartment, I placed the folder on the kitchen counter and opened my laptop. The clock on the screen read 9:42 p.m. I checked my email. Detective Lawson had replied, "I reviewed your documents. Everything checks out. Let's meet Monday morning to finalize your statement." The words were simple, but they felt like a door opening. I exhaled slowly, my hand resting on the mouse. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the soft hum of traffic outside my mind, running through what might happen next. Part of me hoped they'd call, that they'd apologize, or even admit what they'd done. But the phone stayed silent. Maybe that silence was the truest answer I'd ever get from them. By the time dawn filtered through the blinds, I knew what I had to do. I got up, showered, and dressed in my usual work clothes. Nothing dramatic, just neat and simple. I packed the folder, added a USB drive with copies of all the records, and slipped everything into my bag. Before leaving, I paused by the window and looked out at the city waking up. For years, I'd started my mornings thinking about how to help my family survive. This morning, I was thinking about how to survive without them. The police station was quiet when I arrived. The front desk officer directed me to a small office where Detective Lawson was waiting. She greeted me with a nod, motioned for me to sit, and opened a fresh file on her desk. "You're ready?" she asked. I nodded. "Yes, I am." We spent the next hour going through every detail: how they'd accessed my accounts, the timeline of withdrawals, the proof of unauthorized use. Lawson listened carefully, occasionally asking questions to clarify dates or amounts. When we finished, she closed the file and said, "We'll handle it from here. It may take a few days, but we'll contact you once we've verified everything." Her calmness steadied me. "Thank you," I said quietly. She gave a small smile. "You did the right thing." Family doesn't mean you have to accept being hurt. When I left the station, the sky was overcast, the kind of gray that made the air feel heavy but clean. I stood by my car for a long moment, letting the wind brush through my hair, then climbed inside. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked tired but firm, like someone who had finally decided to stop apologizing for protecting herself. I drove home in silence, parked, and sat for a while without turning off the engine. My phone buzzed, once Dad's name flashing on the screen. I let it ring until it stopped. The voicemail notification appeared, but I didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, I looked at the clock on the dashboard. Monday had only just begun, but I knew the hardest part was still ahead. Soon they would realize I wasn't bluffing, and that realization would bring the storm I'd been waiting for. 3 nights passed before I heard back from Detective Lawson. I was sitting at my kitchen table when her name appeared on my phone. "We're ready if you are," she said. Her tone was even, but I could tell everything was set in motion. We agreed to meet at my parents' house at 7 that evening. I stared at the clock after hanging up the reality of what was about to happen, settling deep into my chest. The same house where I'd spent every Christmas morning and every birthday dinner was about to become a crime scene. By late afternoon, the rain had started again, light, but steady, streaking across the windows as I gathered my folder and laptop. I checked the time twice before locking up. The drive felt longer than usual, each turn familiar yet strange under the gray sky. When I reached their street, I parked at the curb instead of in the driveway. The porch light was already on a warm glow that didn't match the cold knot forming in my stomach. Inside the scene was almost identical to the last time I'd been there. The table was set, napkins folded neatly, but no food in sight. Mom hovered near the counter, arranging cups that no one would use. Dad sat in his usual chair, arms crossed, his expression tight. Caleb leaned in, the corner hands in his pockets, trying to look casual but clearly restless. When I stepped in, all 3 of them turned toward me. Dad spoke first. "Guess you decided not to make a scene after all." His voice was thick with irritation and something close to relief. I set my bag on the table and unzipped it slowly. "Let's talk numbers," I said. The sound of paper filled the silence as I pulled out the spreadsheets I'd printed, each page neatly stapled and labeled. I laid them in a row across the table: 1,200 at GameStop Electronics, 614 at Belux Salon, 2,300 toward a car payment that doesn't have my name on it, 4 cash withdrawals, 300 each over 3 days, all within 72 hours of my account being accessed without permission. Caleb's face drained of color. "You kept track of all that?" he asked, his voice uncertain for the first time. I looked at him, steady and quiet. "Every cent." Mom's hands trembled as she pressed them together on the table. "We told you it was for the family," she whispered. "Bills, groceries, things we needed." I met her eyes. "You didn't ask. You took." Dad slammed his palm against the table, the sound echoing through the kitchen. "Enough, Rachel. You've always helped. That's what you're for. Don't start acting like a stranger." His words struck hard, but the power behind them was gone. For once, I didn't feel small. Without a word, I reached into my bag again and placed a thin folder in front of him. "Detective Lawson already has copies of everything I said. She's opened a case file." Caleb let out a sharp laugh, the sound brittle and forced. "You're bluffing. You wouldn't dare." I didn't answer. Instead, I glanced toward the clock above the sink. The minute hand ticked closer to 7. A faint rumble of thunder rolled outside. 3 sharp knocks broke the silence. The sound hit the room like a jolt. Mom flinched. Dad's head snapped toward the door. Caleb froze where he stood. The knocks came again, louder this time. "Open up. Financial Crimes Unit." Dad's voice cracked. You actually did it." I stepped aside as the door opened. Detective Lawson entered first, her badge clipped to her jacket, followed by 2 uniformed officers, one carrying a tablet, the other a clipboard. Her tone was professional calm. "Rachel Monroe." "That's me," I said. "Thank you for your cooperation. We'll take it from here." Mom's voice broke as she rose from her chair. "This is insane. She's our daughter." Lawson didn't flinch. "Family ties don't make illegal activity legal, ma'am." Dad stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. "You're tearing this family apart," he said. I looked at him steady. I'm not tearing anything apart. I'm just refusing to pretend it's still whole. One of the officers began reading rights, the other gathering the evidence from the table. Mom sank back into her seat, staring at the tabletop like she could disappear into it. Caleb muttered something under his breath, but when the officer told him to stay seated, he did. For the first time in years, the room was quiet, in a way I'd never heard before. No shouting, no excuses, just the sound of papers shifting and footsteps on the hardwood floor. Detective Lawson finished her notes and turned toward me. "We'll keep you updated on the next steps," she said gently. I nodded, closing my folder. "Thank you." As they led my family out one by one, I didn't move. Mom reached for my hand as she passed her fingers trembling. "Please, Rachel, we didn't mean to hurt you. We were desperate." I pulled back, my voice soft but firm. "You weren't desperate. You were comfortable, and you thought I'd never stop you." Her eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. Outside, the air was cold and sharp, the kind that wakes you up after a long sleep. I stood on the porch until the sound of car doors closing and engines starting faded down the street. The porch light buzzed faintly above me, casting a pale circle on the steps. I didn't cry. I didn't move. I just listened to the wind, to the quiet, to the part of myself that had finally stopped shaking. When I got home that night, the apartment felt unusually still. I poured a glass of water, sat on the couch, and let the silence settle. My phone vibrated once, then again, then over and over, until the notifications blurred together. I didn't look. Not yet. By the time I finally checked, there were 13 missed calls. 2 from Mom, 1 from Dad, several from an unknown number that could only have been Caleb. I set the phone face down again. The refrigerator hummed softly in the background, a steady reminder that I was finally in control of my own space. I stayed there for a long time, watching the light shift across the wall until the weight of the night caught up with me. For the first time in years, I fell asleep without waiting for the next crisis to arrive. The next morning, sunlight poured through the blinds, sharp and golden like the world outside hadn't noticed what had happened the night before. I sat at my kitchen table, phone in hand, staring at the row of missed calls that had stacked up overnight. 13 in total, Mom, Dad, Caleb, and a few numbers I didn't recognize. I didn't press play on a single voicemail. I just slid the phone face down and poured myself another cup of coffee. The smell filled the apartment, grounding me in the quiet that no one could touch anymore. When I finally gave in and listened to the first message, Mom's voice came through soft but trembling. "Rachel, sweetheart, you didn't have to do this. We could have handled it as a family. The charges are serious. They're saying we might lose the house." Her tone broke halfway through the way it used to when she wanted to pull sympathy out of me. I deleted it before she finished. The next one was Dad's. "This has gone too far. What happened to loyalty? You're humiliating your own family. Think about what people will say." His voice was tight, not from sadness but from outrage. I deleted that one too. Then came Caleb's, sharp, bitter, and filled with the kind of anger that had always been his default. "Hope you're happy. My accounts are frozen. Mom's crying. You ruined our lives over a few payments." The words lingered, but only for a moment. I deleted the message, set my phone down, and leaned back in my chair. The apartment hummed with the same soft rhythm it always had, the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the clock, the muffled sound of traffic outside. It was the first time in years that silence didn't feel like punishment. By the end of that week, the messages slowed, replaced by long text threads filled with guilt, confusion, and blame. I didn't respond to any of them. At first it felt strange not to. I'd built my whole life around solving their crises, stepping in before things fell apart. But now I was watching from a distance as they tried to handle life without me, and the quiet it brought was something close to peace. 3 days later, a message came from an unfamiliar number. It was short and hesitant. "I know we haven't talked in years, but I just wanted to say you were right about them." It was signed Lila, my cousin. We'd been close as kids back when family gatherings still felt safe. But after college, she moved away and I lost touch. I read the message again, slower this time. She continued, "I used to think you were cold. Now I think you were brave. What you did, I don't know if I could have done it." For a long moment I just stared at her words. Brave. No one in my family had ever used that word for me before. I wrote back simply, "Thank you. I hope you're doing all right," she replied almost instantly. "Better now. Seeing you stand up made me realize I don't have to keep letting them walk over me either." Her message settled deep in my chest, a small spark in the quiet that had followed everything else. Maybe what I'd done wasn't just about reclaiming what they'd taken. It was about breaking the cycle that everyone else in our family had been trapped in too. That evening, I took a walk through the neighborhood as the sky turned dusky pink. The air smelled of cut grass and distant rain. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I'd done something as simple as stepping outside without checking my phone for the next emergency. For years, I'd lived like I was always one call away from someone else's problem. Now there was nothing waiting for me but my own life. A week later, another envelope arrived in the mail, no return address, just my name written neatly in black ink. Inside was a check for a small amount and a note in Lila's handwriting. "You were right about everything, the way they treat you, the way they expect without asking. Watching you take a stand gave me the courage to walk away too. This is for everything you paid for when no one else would, the rent, the groceries, the school fees. I know it's not much, but thank you." I read her letter twice before setting it on the table beside my coffee mug. My throat tightened, but not from sadness. It was relief, the kind that comes when someone finally sees you, not for what you've given, but for who you are. The days that followed felt steady, almost quiet enough to rebuild something from the ground up. I went to work, met deadlines, and came home without that weight of wondering who needed what. My evenings belonged to me now. Sometimes I'd cook just for the sake of it, or sit by the window and watch the city lights blink on, one by one. There was no guilt in that peace anymore. Still, there were moments when the silence stretched too far, and my thoughts wandered back to them, the house, the dining table, the flicker of disbelief in their eyes, the night everything changed. I'd wonder if they blamed each other, or still convinced themselves I'd overreacted. Detective Lawson sent updates every so often, short and factual. "The investigation is progressing. Additional evidence has been filed. You'll be notified when hearings are scheduled." One afternoon, I was sorting through mail when another unknown number flashed on my phone. I didn't answer, but a text came through seconds later. "If you drop the charges, we can work something out. No name, no details, just that single sentence." I stared at it, the old instinct to reply flickering for a split second before fading away. Work something out, the same words they'd always used whenever they wanted to pull me back in. I blocked the number without hesitation. The following morning, I met with my attorney to go over updates on the case. He spoke calmly, explaining how long the process could take and what to expect next. His tone was practical, but when he asked if I was okay, I paused for the first time. "I think so," I said finally. "For the first time in a long while, I think I am." That night, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, the city lights reflected in the glass. My phone sat silent beside me, and the quiet didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. Outside, a light rain began to fall, tapping softly against the window. I watched it streak down the glass the way it had that first night after I'd discovered everything. Back then, the rain had sounded heavy like grief. Now it sounded clean. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, paperwork hearings, more distance, but for now there was calm. I closed my eyes and breathed in the sound of the rain, knowing the worst of the storm had already passed. 3 months passed before I heard the final update from Detective Lawson. It was late afternoon when she called, her tone steady, but carrying a sense of closure I hadn't expected. The charges were moving forward. Caleb had lost his job after the investigation reached his employer, and Dad was struggling to find an attorney who would take the case without a large retainer. Mom had been trying to sell a few things, jewelry, old furniture, anything that might help with the legal costs. I listened quietly as Lawson spoke, taking in every word. When she paused, she asked, "Are you doing all right, Miss Monroe?" I looked out the window where sunlight bounced off the glass of the building across from mine. "Yes," I said, "I think I am." After we hung up, I sat at my desk for a long time, tracing the rim of my coffee mug with one finger. The air in the apartment felt different, still familiar, but lighter somehow. For so long, every quiet moment had felt like waiting for the next disaster to hit. Now, the quiet just existed. It didn't demand anything from me. That night, I opened the drawer where I'd been keeping everything related to the case. The folder of bank statements, the printed emails, the notes I'd written in the first weeks after discovering the theft, they were all neatly stacked, untouched for weeks. On top of the pile sat Lila's letter. The sight of it made me smile in a way I hadn't in a long time. I took it out and read it again, tracing her careful handwriting. Her words had become something like a turning point, proof that the truth could ripple further than I'd ever intended. I spent the next few days quietly moving through small routines that had once felt impossible. Grocery shopping without calculating what I'd have to send home, reading on the balcony until dusk, cooking dinner for myself instead of eating at my desk. There was something freeing in doing ordinary things without guilt pressing down on every decision. Still, the calls hadn't completely stopped. Some came from blocked numbers, others from unknown lines. The voicemails were short now, pleas for leniency, angry demands, even one that sounded like an apology buried beneath panic. I never responded. My attorney handled any messages that came through official channels. The rest, I let fade into silence. One evening in early spring, an envelope appeared in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a short note written in my father's handwriting. "We never meant for things to go this far. You'll always be our daughter. Please think about what this is doing to your mother." I stood at the counter reading those words over and over. There was no mention of the money, no acknowledgement of what they had done, just another request for me to feel guilty. I folded the letter neatly, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it in the drawer beside the old statements. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was final. That same week I got another message from Lila. "I wanted you to know I finally moved out. I'm starting over. It's small, but it's mine." She'd attached a photo of a modest apartment sunlight streaming across a secondhand couch, a plant on the windowsill. Beneath it she'd written, "Thank you for showing me it's okay to choose yourself." I stared at the photo for a while, smiling to myself. Maybe this was what change looked like, not loud or dramatic, but quiet, deliberate, and completely one's own. The following weekend, I met Detective Lawson one last time to sign the final round of paperwork. Her office felt smaller than I remembered, filled with stacks of files and the faint scent of coffee. She handed me a copy of the closure notice, the official record confirming the case was ready to move to court. "It's never easy when it's family," she said softly. "But you did everything right." I nodded, taking the folder from her hands. "I didn't want to hurt them," I admitted. She gave a small, understanding smile. "You didn't. You just stopped letting them hurt you." When I left the station, the air was cool and crisp. The sky had that pale blue tone that only appears before sunset, and the trees along the sidewalk swayed gently in the breeze. I walked slowly back to my car, feeling the weight of the last few months ease just a little more with each step. That night, I sat at my desk and opened a blank page in my notebook. I didn't have to, but I wanted to write something down before the moment passed. The words came slowly, at first careful, and measured until they began to flow. "I'm not your bank. I'm not your safety net. I'm not here to bleed for you while you laugh in my face. I'm done. And I was done the second you made it clear you never saw me as anything but a resource." When I finished, I tore the page out gently and folded it in half. I slid it into the same envelope that held Lila's note. I didn't plan to mail it or even read it again. It was enough just to have written it. Proof that the weight I'd carried for years no longer belonged to me. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, warm and bright. I brewed coffee, stood by the window, and watched the city come alive. For the first time in a long while, there was no dread, no urgency, no voice in the back of my mind reminding me of someone else's needs. Just quiet satisfaction in the small, ordinary rhythm of my own life. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who worked late to send extra money home, who skipped her own rent to pay someone else's bills, who believed love meant sacrifice without limit. That girl had survived long enough for me to become someone new, someone who understood that love doesn't mean losing yourself in the process. The phone buzzed once on the counter. I glanced at the screen, an unknown number again, but this time I didn't hesitate. I silenced it, set it aside, and stepped out onto the balcony with my coffee. The morning air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain from the night before. Below, the city moved steadily, unaware of the quiet victory unfolding above it. I leaned against the railing and took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth fill me. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine fully and finally. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the silence anymore. It's strange how peace rarely arrives with fanfare. Sometimes it comes in the smallest moments, like standing by your kitchen window, coffee in hand, realizing you've gone a full day without waiting for the next crisis. That was my life now. Quiet, steady mine. The investigation had closed officially. The court filings were complete, and my family's names were entered into records that would follow them for years. I didn't ask about the sentencing. I didn't need to. The truth was no longer mine to carry. Detective Lawson called once more to let me know everything was finalized. Her tone was calm, the same even strength she'd carried since the beginning. Before hanging up, she said, "You did what most people never find the courage to do. Don't forget that." I thanked her and hung up slowly, letting the silence fill the space. It wasn't victory I felt, just release. The kind that settles deep, not loud or triumphant, but clean. That weekend I decided to tidy my apartment. It was something I used to do out of habit, but this time it felt different, like I was clearing the last traces of someone else's chaos. I stacked the old folders neatly, the evidence that had once consumed my nights, and tucked them into a box. Then I opened the drawer that held Lila's note, and my own letter, the one I'd written but never meant to send. I read them both again. Her words still felt like sunlight breaking through fog. Mine, steady and firm, reminded me that boundaries aren't walls, they're doorways to peace. A few days later, an email arrived from Lila with a photo attached. It was of her and her 2 kids standing in front of a small townhouse. "We're settling in," she wrote. "It's not fancy, but it's home. Thank you again, Rachel." I smiled at the picture for a long time. It reminded me that sometimes standing up for yourself doesn't just change your life, it gives others permission to change theirs too. Spring slipped into summer, and my days found an easy rhythm. I started taking morning walks before work, the kind where the city feels half asleep and the air is soft enough to breathe deeply. I made small plans weekends away, classes I'd always meant to take, even a new couch for the living room. Life didn't feel heavy anymore. It just felt real. Once, while passing through my old neighborhood, I slowed at the edge of my parents' street. The house looked the same from the outside, but the yard was unkept, the windows closed tight. For a moment, I thought about stopping just to see. But then I realized I didn't need to. Whatever waited inside belonged to another version of me, the one who had tried too hard for too long. I drove on the wind soft through the open window. Months later, on a quiet Saturday, I finally opened that box one last time. I sifted through the pages, the receipts, the statements, the years of proof I'd gathered like armor. I didn't feel anger anymore, just clarity. Every document told the same story, how easy it was to give everything until there was nothing left. I gathered the papers, placed them in a shredder, and watched the past turn into thin ribbons of white. That night, I sat on my balcony as the city lights shimmered below. The air was warm, and a soft breeze carried the scent of summer rain. Somewhere inside, I knew I'd already moved on, not because they'd changed, but because I had. Peace, I've learned, isn't the absence of pain. It's the decision to stop reopening the wounds. It's forgiving yourself for all the times you tried to love people who only loved what you could give. It's knowing that letting go doesn't make you cold. It makes you free. I don't think I'll ever hear from my parents again. And that's all right. Some closures don't need words. They just need distance. I have my own kind of family now, people who call to ask how my day was not what I can pay for. I still send Lila messages every so often, sharing photos of coffee shops or small joys that remind me of how far we've both come. Tonight, as I sit here with a mug of tea and the soft hum of the city outside, I feel something I never thought I'd find again: contentment. The kind that doesn't need approval or permission, only truth. If you've ever been the one holding everyone else together, I hope you know this stepping away isn't cruelty. Sometimes it's the only way to finally breathe. You're allowed to protect your peace. You're allowed to start over. And if my story reminded you of your own, take a deep breath tonight. Let the quiet be your proof that you've made it through. Thank you for listening. And if this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who needs to know they can too.